useful for anything, but you can't sneak up on a guinea. And everybody kept guineas around their houses, almost as a watchdog. And you were in pretty bad shape if you had to eat a guinea, because they're tough. You never find their eggs, because they'll go off and hide their eggs, kind of like quail do. But everybody had guineas. Everybody had geese, but you didn't eat a goose. It's very rare that people would eat goose. Now in Europe they did. But why did you have geese? You made pillows, you made mattresses. And you also used the quills for writing instruments before there were steel pens and fountain pens. So everybody had geese, and even after cotton came about, you'd drive herds of geese into the cotton field and they'd pick all the weeds out. But, you know, you just wouldn't. And a goose is kind of stupid, like a dove, and they're easy prey for anything that's going to come in. So you had to kind of keep an eye, and you'd try to pin up geese and ducks. Now, you would eat ducks, and you would eat the eggs of ducks, but you didn't use the feathers or anything on a duck. But, you know, we talk about Congress having a lame duck session. If you had a crippled chicken or a crippled duck, that was the next thing in the pot. And when one of the things, living in an old house, when my house was built, they cooked on the fireplaces. And they never threw anything away, so all the pots and hooks are still there for the fireplace. Even the trammels that they hooked the pots on are still there. And our conceptions of cooking on fireplaces were so wrong. You know, for most things, you think about cooking right over the fire. Our ancestors would rake the hot coals out on the hearth, and you cooked in pots that were on legs, and you'd set them over the coals. And if you had a Dutch oven or a skillet, it had a deep edge around the top, and you'd pile coals in that, so you could cook bread. Our ancestors didn't cook cakes like you think of now. That didn't come about till wood stoves came about. But back they would bake cakes, and you know, we think about, of course, the language that we speak is English, but England and America are separated by language. You go to England, and when they're talking about pudding, they're talking about something for dessert. Our ancestors, when our ancestors made a pudding, they boiled it. When they made the equivalent of a fruit cake in the early 1800s, they boiled it. They would put the ingredients in a cloth and would twist it and put it in a pan of boiling water. It might boil for 3 hours before it was ready. But the traditional Christmas pudding you see in Charles Dickens, that's what our ancestors were eating here. Now, whereas the English would use a lot of suet, which was fat from sheep or whatever, our ancestors would use lard and other things like that. Occasionally they would put, other animal fats in it, but you didn't have all the resources of fruits that we have now. I heard my granddaddy say that his brother ran a hotel in Asheville, North Carolina around the turn of the century, and he would come down here to make fruit cakes because citrus fruit was sometimes available at the end of the summer, August and so forth. And he would cook the fruit cakes for the holiday season for the hotel in August. And then they would pack them in muslin cloth in barrels and then pour wine over them. And they would keep those fruit cakes, from August through until December, which always amazed me. I just never thought about that sort of stuff. But Our ancestors rarely saw citrus fruit. Now, there was a common thing that was grown that would appear in fields, and they actually cultivated it. Something, I don't know if y'all know what I'm talking. Have you ever heard of a citron? It's a watermelon that never turns red. And our ancestors used them for animal feed, hogs in particular, but also, if you go to ancient Europe and Africa and so forth, it was a source of water in the dry season, so they would stack citrons up. And I know that there was an elderly fellow that lived close to Newington that would have hundreds and hundreds of citrons stacked in an enclosed area. That's what he fed his hogs during the winter. But anywhere out in the fields, you find citrons growing. I don't think there's a citron growing on our farm now. When I was a child, they were everywhere. But one of the things you could do is when a citron was little, you could eat it. You could cut it into slices, fry it like squash. And our ancestors did that. And watermelons were popular. People would eat them, but it took a lot of crossbreeding to get the red watermelon. Because if you look at a picture of a watermelon in the 1600s, only a little bit of it was red. A citron tastes like a watermelon rind all the way through. It's not very pleasant. And I know, I talked to all these old people when I was a child, my grandmothers and grandfathers, brothers and sisters, and my great-grandmothers and brothers and sisters, and heard just dozens of stories. And I've tried my best to write down a lot of them, and there's probably 75% of them that I heard that I haven't been able to write down. But, you know, that's what I wish that all of you could do, is write what legacy of memories you have of your family. Think of your parents and your grandparents. Think of your children and your grandchildren. Ask your grandchild what they know about your grandmother or your grandfather, and they'll tell you nothing. Because they don't know. And whatever you pass on to the next generation about your own family and about your family life is the only memory that will survive of that person. You loved your parents to death. You loved your grandparents. But if you don't record something about them to pass to the next generation, they are gone forever. They're just a tombstone in a cemetery somewhere. There's just no memory of those people. So you have an obligation almost, in my opinion, to write what you can about your people. There's just some interesting stories. My great-grandmother, I said, was born in 1881. When she was a child, she spent a lot of time with her grandmother and would sleep in the bed with the grandmother, and I'm sure it was because she kept the old lady warm. And her grandmother was born in the 1820s. And I remember my great-grandmother telling this story, because she was just a little thing, maybe 5 or 6 years old. She had a habit of wetting the bed, as a lot of children do. She'd go to bed with her grandmother in that big feather mattress. But a woman that had formerly been a slave to her grandmother slept under the bed. Because these were way up off, these were teaster beds up off the floor. And she had a pallet, and I guess she had been a body servant because they were always close by with the person that they took care of. And my grandmother described the old woman. She had a white eye. She didn't have a pupil or iris in there. One eye was completely white, the other one she could see from. And my grandmother would wet the bed. She would hear that old woman under the bed saying, "Drip, drip, drip, you little daughter of Satan, drip, drip, drip." I always thought that was a pretty funny story, but just little things like that take you back to a time where, it's just like my great-great-grandmother. I heard the story that she picked collards from horseback in the basin of Gerald Pond when her son, James Hezekiah, was a baby. She had him on one arm and she was picking collards with the other. And he was born in maybe the 1840s. So that's how far back it was. And you can still see Gerald Pond right now off 17 in Screven County. And, you know, there's just dozens of stories. That same woman was taking her children to visit her relatives at what's now Newington. And she was in an ox cart, and the ox, something scared the ox, or he got stung by a bee or a wasp or something, and ran away, tore the ox cart up. So she had the children in front and behind her, and the chair that she sat on in the ox cart on her head, and she got on top of the ox and rode the ox on. I always thought that was an interesting story because that was the first time I'd ever heard of an ox. I didn't know what an oxen was. And, you know, there's just dozens and dozens of stories that they told me that have a tie to a past that we just don't understand or we just don't know about. When this girl, Pamela Wagner, did a survey, one of the things that was in my house that she said she found nowhere else in Georgia was a cooling board. Do y'all know what a cooling board is? It's what they laid the dead out on. And it's a little low table, it's about this high, and it's a little longer than a person is. And when somebody died, they would lay them out on it, and they would bathe the person. And then somebody would make a shroud for them. And you would let the sun rise and set on the body to make sure they were dead. Because the worst thing would be a premature burial. And a lot of times the person would, when they were, you know, on in years, not necessarily old, but maybe 30s and 40s, they'd go ahead and make a casket. My great-grandparents' caskets were moved from the old house to where I live, and they were up in the rafters. And when the old people died, they brought the caskets down and put them in it. They were just wooden boxes.
Now, that shroud, or whatever you want to, not shroud, the cooling board, is that the same thing as at the parsonage in Ebenezer in the hallway?
That's a beer.
Okay.
But there's a cooling board at Historic Effingham in Springfield.
There's
a board, I'm not sure that board has legs. But
since you're interested in Effingham, there's a place called Mesna in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. And there's a table at Mesna that came from Effingham County that was built in 1740.
you can see it online.
Yeah.
Also have
If you ever get a chance to go up to that area of North Carolina, there's a lot of Georgia stuff at Mesna. So it's
they
really
have a
interesting.
ceramic cup from the Ebenezer too.
Oh, do you? There was a silversmith at Ebenezer. Are y'all familiar with coin silver? Like silverware? You know, we have sterling silver now, or some people did. It's almost been replaced completely by stainless steel. But our ancestors, before 1870, most of the silver was made of melted money. And one of the things, if you were wealthy and you had plenty of money, it's easier to identify tables, spoons, and knives, and forks, and so forth, if it's been made, and cups, if it's been made from silver, than it is to identify coins. So our ancestors, as soon as they got a surplus of silver, they would have it made into silverware. Savannah was full of silversmiths. Augusta was full of silversmiths. These were people that would take silver dollars or 50-cent pieces and would melt it down and make silverware out of it. And some of the rarest early silver you see is southern silver will bring 5 times what northern silver does, because people like Paul Revere, of course, that's rare, he was a silversmith. But, the silver from most cities up north, it only brings, maybe say 10% of what a fork or knife or spoon that was made in Savannah and Augusta will bring. Are y'all familiar with coinage very much, what our ancestors did? I had something that I gave to Georgia Southern years ago. There was a guy named Thomas Tippins that taught here in the early 1800s. There are a lot of Tippins in this area, or descendants of Tippins. And like over in Evans County and so forth, which I think was made of Bulloch, Emmanuel, there were Tippins living there. And I had the books that he taught mathematics from. Because you know, when you went to school, you did the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Well, what do you think they taught in math in those days? I was so shocked. Everything had to do with conversions of money. Because until 1857, any coin was legal tender in the United States. And our ancestors did not have American coins. Very, very rare to see an American coin. The most common coins that are found at old house sites and so forth and dug up in this area would be Spanish coins. Because, have you ever seen a document that refers to a Spanish milled dollar? When you bought property, it would be so many Spanish milled dollars. And, you know, that for a long time puzzled me. What are they talking about with a Spanish milled dollar? Then I found out that everything to do with coinage had to do with Spanish currency. That was the most common currency that we saw, although there would be some English and French currency. Surprising to think there were more German speakers in America after the Revolution than there were English speakers. We came within a few votes of making German the national language of the United States of America. There were far fewer English speakers in the U.S. then, mostly German. And Thomas Jefferson was adamant that we were not going to use the English system of coinage in the United States. He said, we want to base our coinage on the Spanish system. And most of what Jefferson proposed didn't work out. But he wanted to make a coin called a dollar that was divided into 1,000 parts, called mills. That's why we have something called millage rate right now. That's the only survivor. The stock market was based on 8ths and 16ths and 32nds and so forth, because you took a Spanish dollar and you cut it into pieces. Here's one. This is what the silver dollar was based on. It's not based on an English coin. When you were in high school, did you ever hear a cheer 2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits a dollar? Well, when they wanted to make change, they would cut, this is 8 reales, 8 reals. That was the Spanish coin. They would cut this thing in half, and that was 4 reals. Cut it into quarters. And a quarter was made of 2 bits, so 25 cents was 2 bits. And, you know, we say this, but we never knew what they were talking about. And surprisingly, our ancestors did cut up coins. Here's a quarter. They cut these Spanish dollars up into pieces and it would circulate. And even they would cut, there was a 4 real piece and it was cut into sections. That's why the stock market was listed in fractions of a cent. You know, you say sometimes, why did the English have so many different denominations? You had a third farthing. A farthing is a fourth of a penny. You had a farthing, which was a fourth of a penny. You had a halfpenny, which was a half penny. You had a penny, which didn't exist very, very much until after the Georges, but they did make a silver penny earlier than that. Then you had tuppence, 2 pence, threepence, 3 pence, a groat, which is 4 pence. The closest thing to a nickel they had was a sixpence. Then they had a shilling, which was 12 pence. Then you had 2 shillings, which was a florin. And it went on and on and on. The closest thing to a dollar they had was 5 shillings. So in early wills in this area, you'll see where somebody was left 5 shillings. Well, they're leaving them $1. So when you see that in an early will, that's what you're seeing. But the reason why the English had all that is most people couldn't read and write. And our ancestors couldn't read and write. But you can do math with all those denominations. You can divide by 2, 1, 3, 4, 5, whatever you want to in the English system, because you might not be able to read and write, but you knew if you were being shortchanged. And our ancestors knew how to convert currency. You had a gold sequin from the Middle East. You knew what that was worth here in Bulloch County in 1830. You had a French écu. You knew what that was worth. Because you know, everything in math, even people that couldn't read and write could do math. And most of math was calculating money. And I was just baffled by that. I just had no idea, because I was thinking of Euclidean geometry and all this math and stuff that I had to learn in high school, which was useful, I guess. But our ancestors learned something totally different. They had a whole different reason for it. And I'll pass this around if y'all have never seen that. And the reason why they call it milled, and I'll show you this, look at the edge of this. On quarters and dimes and so forth, you have a reeded edge now. Milled edge meant that there was a pattern printed all the way around the edge, because you know what our ancestors did? They'd take a knife and shave a little bit off. And when they got enough shavings, they would be able to melt it and make another coin. Of course, that was considered counterfeiting. And that was the worst penalty that our English ancestors could inflict. You would be hanged till almost the point of death, taken down, disemboweled while you were still alive, and then cut into 4 pieces and dragged off by horses. And that went on until 1800. Even children were executed for counterfeiting. They would hang a child as young as 6 years old by putting a barrel under the gallows and hanging them. If you really wanted to mess with somebody, you counterfeited. And even in this country, counterfeiting is, you know, it goes on all the time, but we don't get the death penalty for counterfeiting, but you certainly got it in England. And a lot of our ancestors came to America as prisoners because they had been convicted of counterfeiting. And they were given the choice of being executed or you'd be deported to the Americas or to Australia. And that's how those countries were settled. Do any of y'all have any questions about any particular part of history that, you know, our past or whatever? There's just so many things to know. And all I can tell you is to read. I brought a box of just junk that I had stored in a place, just to show you how things were. You know, everything's plastic now. Do y'all know what these are?
Needles.
Knit needles. is before celluloid. Celluloid was made as something that looked like bone. Here's a crochet needle made out of bone. And you can tell by looking at this close that it's pieces of bone. Here's a ruler made out of bone. If you find an old ruler, here's the peculiar thing about them, is they, and I don't have real good use of my hands, but I think I can do this. This is a foot ruler. And it's made out of bone. And you see all rulers, sometimes they would even make them out of wood, but they fold it up like this. In the 1800s, 1700s, and right on back. The bone one's probably about 200 years old. This is about 175 years old. And this, and this. Do you know what these are? These are called gimlets. There's a mixed drink called a gimlet that took its name from this. But this has a little end like a drill